Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and another recording, Chapter 25 Key Questions. Number one, what issues came with the growth of American cities? Well, obviously, you have some major issues with anytime you have urbanization, when people move to the city. A lot of it has to do with living conditions. I mentioned in class tenement housing, the fact that they lived in cramped houses, cramped, dirty, unventilated, dark houses with sharing many people sharing the same bedroom and sharing water and sharing living spaces leads to a lot of disease and death. You then have, of course, the issue of waste disposal, garbage disposal, crime. As overpopulation occurs, crime is a major issue. Um, so there are a lot of different issues that face people living in the cities, and urbanization always brings those issues about. So number two, explain the differences between old and new immigrants. And then why were new immigrants disliked more than old immigrants? So old immigrants were primarily from Britain, Germany, and Ireland, which are all Western European nations. Meanwhile, new immigrants came mostly from South and Eastern Europe, from places like Italy, Croatia, Greece, Poland, Russia, Slavic areas. For the old immigrants, most of them came over fairly literate. And if they weren't literate, they could at least speak our language. For new immigrants, they were not literate. They were very poorly educated. They came from poor areas. And so that combined with a language barrier made them less likely to be able to assimilate here in America. The Germans and the Irish and the British naturally assimilated into our culture, while the new immigrants did not. And finally, one of the other challenges from new immigrants was the fact that a lot of them were Catholic. And America heavily disliked Catholicism. So that added to more tension there. So why were they more disliked? To summarize, culturally they were more different. They were from regions that were more much different from the culture that America had and that of Western Europe. They were less educated and illiterate, and they had that language barrier that came along with that. And then finally, of course, the religious difference, as many of them were Catholic. Number three, describe various reactions to new immigrants, both positive and negative. I guess you could call it positive, but Tammany Hall and other political machines gave out benefits to immigrants. That was in order to get political power from them. While that is overall an immoral and unethical thing to do, for immigrants, it was a group who was willing to take care of them. The other positives would come from people like Walter Rauschenbusch or people like Jane Addams, who joined in the social gospel movement and believed that the church had a moral requirement to help out these people living in the cities. Some even term this the shame of the cities, the conditions that immigrants were living in and how they were being treated. So the social gospel movement leads to the creation of organizations like the YMCA, Red Cross, Salvation Army. And then you have Jane Addams, who founds the Whole House, which is the beginning of the Settlement House movement. A lot of these provided simple social services for immigrants, helping them assimilate, and also education so they could fit in American culture much better. The negative responses include the rise of nativism, specifically nativism in the form of just trying to remove their economic and political ability to gain power. The fears were that there was going to be a high birth rate, they would eventually outvote us. Americans were terrified of the radical political ideas like socialism, communism, and anarchism. They could also be used to break up strikes. And so in the workplace, there was tension between former workers and these new immigrants. So this leads to groups like the American Protective Association, APA. They said that they would not vote or hire any Catholics. They even proposed literacy tests to try to block them from gaining any further political power. And then related to this rise of immigration, although the Chinese aren't considered new immigrants, they, of course, underwent exclusion through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and no more of them could immigrate over here. So that brings us to question number 4. Explain the differences between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These two men have very different backgrounds. Booker T. Washington was a former slave from the South. Du Bois was the first Harvard-educated African-American from Massachusetts. And so their backgrounds really shape how they went about trying to achieve African-American rights. Booker T. Washington is what many call an accommodationist. He believed that blacks should almost accept segregation as it was now, so that later on, after they had climbed the social and economic ladders, they then could be treated equally because they were, in all aspects of society, equal to whites. People like Du Bois were heavily offended by this because they believed that blacks deserved their rights immediately. You should not have to wait or accept mistreatment before they received these rights. So Du Bois begins pushing for things like the Niagara movement. He also helps create the NAACP, which pushes for African Americans to be treated fairly and to fight against discrimination. Meanwhile, Booker T. Washington created places like the Tuskegee Institute, which trained them and gave African Americans skills to get better jobs. So both these men have the same goal in mind, and that's African American equality, but both had very different backgrounds and different approaches to how to accomplish it. Number 5, what is yellow journalism? Yellow journalism is exaggerated or made up stories that are used to sell newspapers. Many times they focus on issues like sex and scandals and different human interest stories. This sensational type of newspaper writing shouldn't come to any surprise of us today with the hashtag fake news movement and different political organizations that incite anger and outrage for clicks and money. So yellow journalism is a predecessor of our current sensational media, and two major guys push it. That's Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. We'll talk later about this, but their yellow journalism will eventually help drag America into the Spanish-American War. Number 6, what did Henry George and Edward Bellamy's writings have in common? Both of these men had fairly radical writings. Henry George suggested in his book Progress and Poverty that the government needed to step in to help the poor. Specifically, he suggested a 100% tax on profits from purchasing land. Since land was something that rich people bought and made money off of and then charged rent or sold it at a premium price, he thought that a 100% tax on profits would help share the wealth in that sense. Edward Bellamy, meanwhile, wrote the book Looking Backward, which is more of a dream and kind of an idealistic storytelling thing. But he dreamed of a government which took over big business to serve the public. So what both of these people have in common is they showed that they wanted the government to step in and to save the working class individual from powerful businessmen. When you consider them in the scheme of the Gilded Age and the fact that people were struggling everywhere, you can realize that many people, workers, farmers, and then even writers like George and Bellamy, believe that the government needs to step in and help regular Americans. Number 7, describe the goals and accomplishments of the following women. So these women, Ida B. Wells, Carrie Chapman Catt, and then Victoria, accidentally went down the line, Woodhull, they all pushed forward for different movements, but all were quite influential. Ida B. Wells was an African-American woman, and she addressed the issues of lynching, that African Americans were being lynched at a ridiculous rate, and that the government needed to step in and do something to save African Americans being treated this way. So she also helped create the National Association of Colored Women, which kind of organized them politically. But she's most remembered, Ida B. Wells, for her push against lynching. For Carrie Chapman Catt, she also was a major force in the women's political and women's rights movement. So she helps form NAWSA, NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. It's a long name, but basically she just pushes for women to have the right to vote. She claimed that women's traditional role in the home meant that they needed a say in politics. What's funny is men's claim that women should stay in the home. She said, well, because they stayed in the home, then they had the best idea of how to best serve the families in American society. And so their vote meant a lot in making sure their children were looked after. Then finally, a Victoria Woodhull. She is quite an interesting woman because she challenged women's place in society, but she's most remembered for her defense of free love, also pushing for the practice of birth control. She's going to be a major force in something we'll call new morality. And going in the 1920s, when women really do begin to get more independence financially and politically and lay the groundwork for the flappers that we see in that decade, Victoria Woodhull really does lay the groundwork to those movements because she pushes for women to have the equality of action and also the equality in politics. Then finally, what was the City Beautiful movement? Basically, America had growing cities, but we needed to grow our cities in a way that was aesthetically pleasing. In other words, they looked good. They weren't just dingy buildings and just kind of, I guess you could say, practical buildings, but rather we would build places that we could be proud of. Think back to a lot of places you see in Europe, which are scenic and beautiful and wonderful. Places like Louis XIV's Palace Versailles. America really didn't have those things, as we were simply building as we went and not really planning anything too beautiful. So the City Beautiful movement saw men like Frederick Law Olmsted building Central Park, or designing the Millennium Park much later on in Chicago. We see our cities actually beginning to inspire us and look Good. That may seem a strange thing to add in here, but it is one of the things that they think about on the AP test. With all that said, that's the chapter 25 questions. There's several other details inside the chapter, such as those over education that you might want to look over, and also the growing amusement that will become popular as radio is mass produced in the 1920s. But for right now, that's all we've got for chapter 25. If you have any questions or want to hear more about it, you know where to ask. See ya!